The manuscript was still warm when they found it in the Vatican's deepest archive. 3 cardinals had touched it before the screaming started. When you understand what those symbols actually meant, you'll realize why the Church has been preparing for something that was never supposed to be just a myth. In the basement of the Apostolic Archive, beneath layers of security that most governments would envy, sits a collection that officially doesn't exist. Room Omega 7 contains documents so dangerous that only 7 people alive have clearance to enter. The manuscript discovered there in 2019 changed everything we thought we knew about the Antichrist. Not because it proved the prophecies true, but because it revealed something far more terrifying. The prophecies were instructions. If you want to understand how deep this conspiracy actually goes, hit that subscribe button now, because what I'm about to show you will make you question every religious authority you've ever trusted. The evidence suggests they've been following a script for 2,000 years. The story begins with a simple rule that early Christians established: never seek the Antichrist actively, because the act of searching creates the conditions for his arrival. It's a paradox that would seem theological if it weren't for the mathematical precision with which every search has been followed by global catastrophe. The Crusades followed Pope Urban's declaration that Muslims were harbingers of the final enemy. The Black Death swept Europe just decades after the Church began systematically hunting heretics they labeled as Antichrist servants. World War I erupted within years of the modern fundamentalist movement's obsession with identifying the beast's mark in technology and politics. But the Vatican manuscript reveals something that makes these correlations look like child's play. According to the document, attributed to a scribe named Matthias who claims to have witnessed Christ's actual words about the end times, Jesus never prophesied the Antichrist's coming. He warned against creating him. The original text, written in a dialect of Aramaic that modern scholars had to reconstruct from fragments, reads differently than anything in the canonical Gospels. Instead of predicting a figure who would rise to deceive the masses, it describes what Matthias calls the summoning through expectation. The more humanity searches for ultimate evil, the more it shapes reality to produce that evil. The Antichrist, according to this interpretation, is not sent by Satan or ordained by God, but manufactured by collective human obsession with finding an enemy worthy of absolute hatred. This interpretation might sound like academic curiosity, if not for what happened to the research team that first translated the manuscript. Dr. Sarah Chen, the Aramaic specialist from Oxford, was the first to disappear. Her last email to colleagues described impossible synchronicities occurring around her work, traffic lights changing precisely when she needed them to, strangers approaching her with conversations that seemed to continue discussions she'd been having internally about the text. Phone calls where the caller would hang up after saying exactly the phrase she'd been thinking. Father Antonio Restrepo, the Vatican's liaison to the research project, vanished 3 days after Chen. The security footage from his apartment building shows him entering the elevator on the 7th floor, but he never reached the ground level. The elevator was empty when it opened. No emergency stops, no mechanical failures, no other exits. He simply ceased to exist between floors 6 and 5. The third disappearance broke the pattern that investigators were beginning to recognize. Dr. Michael Thornton, a historian specializing in early Christian texts, didn't vanish mysteriously. He died in his sleep, apparently of a heart attack, despite being 34 years old, with no history of cardiac problems. But his death came with a detail that connected it to the others. He was found clutching a note written in his own handwriting that read, "The number is increasing. It knows we know." Handwriting analysis confirmed the script was his, but Thornton's family insisted he'd been left-handed since childhood. The note was written with his right hand. The Vatican immediately classified the entire project beyond top secret and relocated the manuscript to a facility that, according to leaked documents, requires biometric clearance from the Pope himself. But not before Dr. Chen's research notes were copied by someone with access to the project. Those copies, leaked to investigative journalists in 2021, contain translations that explain why the church reacted so aggressively to shut down the research. According to Matthias's account, Jesus described the mechanism by which focused attention on ultimate evil becomes a summoning circle of consciousness. When enough minds simultaneously hold detailed expectations of a specific type of malevolent leader, reality begins conforming to those expectations. The collective unconscious, already primed by centuries of prophecy and preparation, starts recognizing patterns that fit the predetermined narrative. Leaders who match the prophetic description gain power not through supernatural intervention, but through the gravitational pull of millions of minds that have been trained to recognize and respond to specific signals. The manuscript describes this process in terms that sound almost like modern chaos theory. Small actions aligned with prophetic expectations create cascading effects that amplify until they reshape political and social realities. A leader who understands the prophetic template can consciously trigger these responses, using humanity's own religious conditioning to engineer their rise to power. But here's where the Vatican manuscript becomes genuinely disturbing. It provides specific instructions for both summoning and preventing the Antichrist phenomenon. The prevention method requires what Matthias calls breaking the expectation cycle by deliberately teaching populations to recognize and resist the prophetic pattern recognition. According to the text, early Christian communities were originally established not to spread the gospel of Christ's divinity, but to inoculate human consciousness against the specific type of messianic manipulation that Jesus identified as the greatest threat to human freedom. The summoning instructions are even more detailed. They describe psychological and political techniques for amplifying religious anxiety, creating artificial scarcity and conflict, and positioning oneself as the solution to problems that one has secretly created. The manuscript reads like a playbook for manufacturing the exact conditions that apocalyptic prophecies describe: wars, famines, plagues, and the collapse of traditional moral authorities. What makes this more than historical curiosity is the evidence that someone has been following the summoning instructions with systematic precision for decades. Analysis of global political trends since 1945 reveals patterns that match the manuscript's descriptions of preparation phases almost exactly. The creation of international institutions designed to fail at critical moments. The deliberate cultivation of religious fundamentalism across multiple faiths simultaneously. The engineering of technological advances that create both unprecedented connectivity and unprecedented surveillance capabilities. Most disturbing is the timing. According to the manuscript, the summoning process requires approximately 70 years of preparation, followed by a 7-year acceleration phase, followed by a final triggering event that transforms prepared conditions into actual manifestation. If this timeline is accurate, and if the preparation phase began around 1948 with the establishment of Israel and the beginning of the Cold War, then the acceleration phase would have started around 2018. The acceleration phase, according to Matthias, is characterized by the rapid normalization of conditions that previous generations would have recognized as obviously apocalyptic. Global pandemic, simultaneous natural disasters on multiple continents, the breakdown of shared truth between different segments of the population, the rise of leaders who openly embrace authoritarian tactics while maintaining democratic legitimacy, the emergence of technology that makes mass surveillance and social control not just possible but inevitable. But the acceleration phase has another characteristic that connects it directly to the research team's disappearances. Reality begins responding to focused attention in ways that violate normal causality. People who understand what's happening start experiencing impossible coincidences and synchronicities. The boundary between internal thoughts and external events becomes permeable. time itself seems to flow differently around information related to the summoning process. Dr. Chen's notes describe this phenomenon in detail during her final weeks of work. She reported that every time she made a breakthrough in translating a particular passage, she would encounter real-world situations that seemed designed to confirm or expand on the translation. When she decoded a section about false prophets using technology to create the illusion of miracles, her television began displaying programming that hadn't been scheduled and didn't exist in any broadcast database. When she translated warnings about the Antichrist's ability to speak directly into believers' minds, she started receiving phone calls where she could hear her own thoughts being spoken back to her in her own voice. The Vatican's response to these reports provides another piece of the puzzle. Instead of dismissing Chen's experiences as psychological breakdown under stress, they immediately expanded security around the project and began implementing what internal documents describe as reality stabilization protocols. These protocols, developed by a team that included physicists and theologians working together, were designed to prevent information about the manuscript from bleeding through into consensus reality. The fact that the Catholic Church has physicists on staff specifically to deal with supernatural phenomena becoming physically manifest should tell you how seriously they take this threat. The Vatican has been preparing for the possibility that apocalyptic prophecies might be more than symbolic for a very long time. But the reality stabilization protocols failed. By 2020, researchers working on similar projects at other institutions began reporting identical phenomena. A team at the University of Edinburgh studying Nostradamus' prophecies found that their computers began generating predictions that proved accurate within days. Scholars at the École pratique des hautes études in Paris, investigating medieval accounts of demonic manifestation, discovered that reading certain texts aloud in their original languages produced measurable electromagnetic disturbances in their laboratory equipment. Most significantly, a joint project between MIT and the Vatican Observatory, ostensibly studying historical astronomy texts, detected what they describe as temporal echoes around dates mentioned in apocalyptic literature. According to leaked reports, their instruments registered energy signatures around prophetically significant dates that corresponded to future events, as if information was somehow traveling backward through time. This is where the story becomes not just mysterious, but actively dangerous to investigate. The researchers who leaked these reports began experiencing the same reality distortions that had affected the original Vatican team. Phone calls from numbers that don't exist. Mail delivery of letters they had written but never sent. Traffic cameras recording them in locations they had never visited. The pattern suggests that information itself about the Antichrist phenomenon has become what intelligence agencies call hazardous intelligence. Simply knowing about it changes your relationship to reality in ways that make you a liability to normal social functioning. The Vatican's classification of the project beyond top secret wasn't just about protecting religious doctrine. It was about preventing information that literally rewrites reality from spreading uncontrollably. But here's what the Church didn't anticipate. The acceleration phase means the information wants to spread. According to the manuscript, during the final preparation period, knowledge about the summoning process begins to surface spontaneously across multiple independent sources. People with no connection to each other start receiving the same insights. Historical documents that have been hidden for centuries suddenly become available. Archaeological discoveries happen in precisely the right sequence to confirm the most dangerous interpretations of prophecy. This spontaneous emergence of dangerous knowledge isn't accidental. The manuscript describes it as the revelation phase that precedes manifestation. The collective unconscious, now thoroughly prepared by decades of conditioning, begins to actively seek out information that will complete the summoning process. Individuals become unwitting channels for intelligence that serves the manifestation agenda rather than their own conscious intentions. The evidence for this is everywhere once you know how to look. Conspiracy theories that promote apocalyptic thinking have become mainstream entertainment. Popular culture has shifted toward narratives that normalize the idea of hidden elites controlling world events from behind the scenes. Religious movements across different faiths have simultaneously developed more aggressive end-times theology. Political discourse has evolved to frame every major issue in terms of ultimate good versus ultimate evil. All of this would be concerning but manageable if not for what the manuscript reveals about the triggering event. According to Matthias, the final step in the summoning process requires a moment when the majority of Earth's population simultaneously experiences the same fear. Not just similar fears, but literally the same fear at the same time, focused on the same object. The manuscript describes this as the Great Recognition, when enough minds suddenly understand that everything they feared was coming has already arrived. The technology for creating such a moment exists now in ways it never has throughout human history. Global communication networks can deliver identical information to billions of people within minutes. Social media algorithms are designed to amplify emotional content, particularly fear-based content, with mathematical precision. The infrastructure for coordinating a planet-wide psychological event is not only available, it's already being used for commercial and political purposes every day. But the triggering event isn't just about technology reaching the right people at the right time. According to the manuscript, it requires a figure who embodies the prophetic template so perfectly that recognition becomes automatic and undeniable. Someone whose personal characteristics, rise to power, and public actions align so precisely with apocalyptic expectations that seeing them triggers an involuntary response in minds that have been conditioned by generations of religious preparation. This figure doesn't need to be supernatural or even consciously evil. They just need to understand how to use humanity's own prophetic conditioning against itself. The manuscript suggests that the most effective Antichrist would be someone who appears to oppose the very forces they're actually serving. Someone whose resistance to apocalyptic scenarios provides cover for advancing them. The Vatican's internal analysis of contemporary world leaders, leaked in fragments over the past several years, shows that they've been systematically evaluating public figures against the prophetic template since at least 2016. Their scoring system measures characteristics like ability to generate devotion that transcends rational political analysis, tendency to create crisis situations that demand unprecedented responses, skill at presenting themselves as both insider and outsider to established power structures, and capacity to make traditional moral categories seem inadequate or obsolete. Several contemporary leaders score disturbingly high on these metrics, but the Vatican's analysis suggests that focusing on individual candidates misses the point. The summoning process doesn't require a single figure. It requires a cultural moment when the prophetic template becomes politically irresistible. When populations become so exhausted by manufactured crisis and artificial scarcity that they're willing to accept any leader who promises to end their suffering, regardless of what that leader actually represents. We may be witnessing the emergence of that cultural moment right now. Global events since 2020 have created psychological conditions that match the manuscript's description of the Great Weakening that precedes the Great Recognition. Populations that have been systematically traumatized by crisis are predictably more susceptible to authoritarian solutions. Democratic institutions that have been deliberately stressed to the point of failure provide justification for abandoning democratic principles in favor of emergency leadership. The manuscript contains one final detail that connects all of this to the researchers' disappearances and the reality distortions experienced by anyone who gets too close to this information. According to Matthias, the summoning process creates what he calls temporal displacement around itself. As manifestation approaches, time begins to flow differently for people who understand what's happening. They experience events before they occur. They receive information from sources that don't yet exist, They become unstuck from the normal sequence of cause and effect. This temporal displacement serves multiple functions in the summoning process. It isolates people who might be able to prevent the manifestation by making their warning seem insane to anyone operating within normal time. It provides early warning to those managing the summoning by showing them the consequences of their actions before they take them. And it creates a feedback loop where effects precede causes, making the manifestation increasingly inevitable as it approaches. Dr. Chen's final research notes describe experiencing this temporal displacement in the weeks before her disappearance. She reported receiving emails that referenced conversations she hadn't yet had, finding books in her apartment that she didn't remember purchasing, but that contained exactly the information she needed for her next day's work, and encountering strangers who seemed to know details about her research that she had shared with no one. Most disturbing, she reported that her dreams had begun to feel more real than her waking life. In her dreams, she was living in a world where the Antichrist had already risen to power and was systematically dismantling every institution that might resist his authority. These dreams were so vivid and consistent that she began to suspect they weren't dreams at all, but glimpses of a future that was actively reaching backward to ensure its own creation. The Vatican's response to these reports provides the final piece of evidence that the Church understands exactly what they're dealing with. Instead of psychiatric evaluation or medical intervention, they assigned Chen a team of what internal documents describe as temporal containment specialists. These specialists, according to the leaked communications, are trained to help researchers maintain psychological coherence while experiencing non-linear time effects related to apocalyptic investigation. The existence of temporal containment specialists in the Vatican's employ means the Catholic Church has been dealing with reality distortions around apocalyptic research for long enough to develop specialized expertise. This isn't a new phenomenon. It's an ongoing issue that the Church has been quietly managing for decades, possibly centuries. But the acceleration phase means these containment strategies are failing. The number of researchers experiencing temporal displacement has increased exponentially since 2018. Universities around the world have quietly established protocols for handling faculty members who begin reporting precognitive experiences related to their research. Government intelligence agencies have created task forces specifically to monitor and manage what they classify as reality breach incidents around sensitive historical investigation. The infrastructure for containing supernatural investigation exists because the supernatural effects of that investigation have become undeniably real. We're not talking about religious belief or psychological suggestion. We're talking about measurable physical phenomena that violate the assumptions underlying normal scientific methodology. This brings us to the most important question. If the summoning process is real, and if we're currently in the acceleration phase, is there anything that can be done to prevent the manifestation? The manuscript provides instructions for what Matthias calls the Great Forgetting, a coordinated effort to break the prophetic conditioning that makes the summoning possible. The Great Forgetting requires simultaneously reducing focus on apocalyptic scenarios while increasing awareness of how prophetic thinking influences political and social behavior. Essentially, humanity has to become consciously aware of how its own religious conditioning makes it vulnerable to manipulation, without becoming so focused on that vulnerability that it amplifies the very patterns it's trying to resist. This is extraordinarily difficult because the acceleration phase means information about the summoning process spreads whether people want it to or not. Anyone who learns about the Antichrist phenomenon in detail becomes a vector for transmitting that information to others, often without conscious intention. The knowledge itself becomes virulent, seeking out minds that are prepared to receive it and transforming those minds into sources of further transmission. The Vatican has experimented with various approaches to the Great Forgetting, according to leaked documents. They've funded research into what they call prophetic inoculation, exposing populations to controlled versions of apocalyptic scenarios in fictional contexts, hoping to reduce their psychological impact when encountered in real-world contexts. They've supported educational programs that teach critical analysis of religious and political manipulation. They've even explored pharmaceutical interventions that might reduce susceptibility to prophetic conditioning. None of these approaches have proven effective at scale. The manuscript suggests this is because the great forgetting can't be imposed from above. It has to emerge organically from individual decisions to reject prophetic thinking patterns. But individual decisions are exactly what the acceleration phase makes most difficult, because reality itself begins to confirm prophetic expectations for anyone who's paying attention. We're trapped in a paradox where understanding the threat requires focusing attention on it, but focusing attention on it amplifies the threat. The manuscript describes this as the final test of human consciousness, whether humanity can become aware of its own conditioning without being controlled by that conditioning. The researchers who disappeared may have solved this paradox, but in a way that removes them from normal reality entirely. The Vatican's temporal containment specialists report that people experiencing advanced stages of temporal displacement don't actually vanish. They become unstuck from linear time in a way that makes them unable to interact normally with people still operating within sequential causality. They still exist, but in a temporal framework that's incompatible with normal social functioning. This suggests that there may be communities of researchers and investigators who have moved beyond the prophetic conditioning entirely, but who can no longer communicate their insights to people still trapped within linear time and apocalyptic expectations. They exist in the same physical space, but in a different temporal relationship to that space. If this interpretation is correct, then the disappearances aren't tragedies but escapes. The people who vanished found a way out of the summoning process, but that way out requires abandoning the shared reality that makes normal human community possible. They saved themselves, but became unable to save anyone else. This creates a terrible choice for anyone who encounters this information. You can maintain normal social functioning by refusing to investigate further, but that leaves you vulnerable to the summoning process and whatever manifestation it's designed to create. Or you can investigate deeply enough to free yourself from prophetic conditioning, but risk becoming so displaced from normal time that you can't help others avoid the same trap. The manuscript suggests there's a third option, but it requires collective action on a scale that seems impossible given current levels of social fragmentation. If enough people simultaneously chose to reject prophetic thinking patterns while maintaining normal social engagement, they could create what Matthias calls a new timeline, where the summoning process becomes impossible because the collective unconscious is no longer prepared to recognize and respond to apocalyptic templates. But this collective choice would have to happen spontaneously, without coordination or leadership, because any organized effort to prevent the Antichrist's manifestation becomes itself a form of focused attention that amplifies the summoning process. The solution has to emerge from individual insight that spreads organically, like a benevolent version of the viral information transmission that characterizes the acceleration phase. The evidence suggests this may already be beginning to happen. Despite increased apocalyptic thinking in some segments of the population, others are developing what researchers call prophetic immunity, automatic resistance to manipulation techniques that exploit religious conditioning. Younger generations, raised with awareness of how media and political messaging work, seem naturally less susceptible to the type of messianic thinking that enables the summoning process. But prophetic immunity isn't spreading fast enough to prevent manifestation if the manuscript's timeline is accurate. The acceleration phase is designed to overwhelm rational analysis with crisis conditions that make apocalyptic solutions seem inevitable. And the reality distortions around apocalyptic investigation make it extremely difficult for researchers to share their insights without triggering the temporal displacement that removes them from normal social functioning. We may be witnessing the final phase of a process that's been developing for centuries. The infrastructure for global psychological coordination exists. Political conditions match prophetic expectations with mathematical precision. The technology for creating simultaneous worldwide recognition of a single figure exists and is actively being used. The collective unconscious has been prepared through generations of religious conditioning to recognize and respond to specific symbolic patterns. All that remains is the emergence of a figure who understands how to trigger the great recognition by embodying the prophetic template perfectly enough to activate humanity's apocalyptic conditioning simultaneously across cultures and belief systems. The terrifying possibility is that this figure doesn't need to be evil or even consciously aware of their role in the summoning process. They just need to be someone whose personal characteristics and political rise align precisely with prophetic expectations that have been building for 2,000 years. Someone whose very presence in public consciousness triggers the recognition that everything humanity has been prepared to fear has finally arrived. The Vatican manuscript ends with a warning that reads like a prophecy itself. When the great recognition begins, it will spread faster than any plague, because it travels through consciousness itself rather than physical contact. Those who understand what they are recognizing will be unable to stop recognizing it. Those who refuse to understand will be compelled to participate anyway. The manifestation completes itself through the act of being recognized, and recognition becomes inevitable once the template achieves sufficient precision. This suggests that we may be approaching a point of no return, where the summoning process becomes self-completing, regardless of human choice. If enough minds have been conditioned to recognize apocalyptic patterns, and if those patterns are manifesting with sufficient precision in current events, then the great recognition may occur automatically as soon as the triggering conditions are met. The researchers who disappeared may have been trying to prevent exactly this scenario. Their investigation into the Vatican manuscript wasn't academic curiosity. It was an attempt to understand and interrupt a process that threatens to transform human consciousness in ways that make freedom and rational choice impossible. But their disappearance suggests that interrupting the process may require sacrifices that most people aren't prepared to make. Breaking free from prophetic conditioning may require abandoning the shared reality that makes human community possible. Preventing the Antichrist's manifestation may require becoming so displaced from normal time that you can no longer participate in the world you're trying to save. This creates an impossible situation where the solution to the problem makes you unable to implement the solution. The people most capable of preventing apocalyptic manifestation are exactly the people who become unable to communicate with anyone still trapped within apocalyptic thinking patterns, unless there's another way. The manuscript mentions one final possibility that hasn't been explored by any of the research teams. The great recognition might be reversible if it's recognized as recognition rather than as objective truth. If enough people can simultaneously understand that they're experiencing a conditioned response rather than perceiving ultimate reality, the manifestation might collapse back into the realm of symbol and metaphor where it began. But this would require a level of collective self-awareness that humanity has never achieved. It would require millions of people to recognize their own psychological conditioning in the moment that conditioning is most powerfully activated. It would require maintaining rational analysis during an experience designed to overwhelm rational analysis with immediate, undeniable recognition of ultimate evil. The question isn't whether this is possible, but whether it's possible in time. The acceleration phase means events are moving faster than human institutions can adapt. The reality distortions around apocalyptic investigation mean the people with the most relevant knowledge are being systematically removed from normal social functioning. The viral nature of prophetic information means awareness of the problem becomes part of the problem. We're racing against a process that uses our own awareness against us, where learning about the threat amplifies the threat, and where the solution requires collective insight that becomes less likely as the threat intensifies. The Vatican manuscript may be the most dangerous document in human history, not because of what it reveals about supernatural forces, but because of what it reveals about the human mind's vulnerability to its own conditioning. The story of the Antichrist may not be about the arrival of ultimate evil from outside human consciousness, but about the manifestation of ultimate evil from within human consciousness when it becomes trapped by its own expectations. The final enemy may not be a supernatural being, but the human capacity for creating exactly the reality it most fears through the act of fearing it. And if that's true, then the only way to prevent the manifestation is to stop participating in the recognition process, even when everything around us seems designed to make that recognition inevitable. But the acceleration phase means we may already be past the point where individual choice can prevent collective manifestation. The summoning may have achieved sufficient momentum to complete itself, regardless of human resistance, in which case the researchers who disappeared may have made the right choice. Sometimes the only way to win is not to play the game at all, even if not playing means abandoning the world you're trying to save. The Vatican manuscript concludes with a single word written in a different hand than the rest of the text: choose. Whether that word was written by Matthias, by one of the missing researchers, or by something else entirely remains unknown. But the implications are clear. The time for passive investigation is over. The Great Recognition approaches, and humanity has to decide whether it will participate in its own prophetic conditioning or find a way to transcend it entirely. The choice may already be made, but the consequences are still unfolding, and they're unfolding faster than anyone expected. The basement of the Matthias Institute held more than records. Dr. Sarah Chen descended the metal stairs, each step echoing in ways that suggested the space below was far larger than the blueprints indicated. Her flashlight beam cut through darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "The building permits show a standard basement," she murmured into her recording device. "But the acoustics suggest—" She paused, listening to her own voice fade into an impossible distance. The first anomaly appeared 30 feet from the stairs. A door that shouldn't exist, marked only with a brass placard bearing a single symbol. The same spiral pattern found in Matthias's final notes. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but deeper darkness beyond. Chen approached with the methodical caution of someone who'd investigated too many unexplained disappearances. The Institute's official records mention no sub-basement levels, no additional storage areas, no reason for this door to exist. Yet here it was. The brass handle turned without resistance. Beyond the threshold, Chen's flashlight revealed a corridor that violated every principle of the building's architecture. Where the basement should have ended, the passage continued for what appeared to be hundreds of feet, lined with doors bearing sequential numbers. Room 001, Room 002, Room 003. Each door identical except for the numbers, each standing slightly open, each revealing only darkness beyond. "This is impossible," Chen whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. In her 3 years investigating the Institute's anomalies, she'd learned that impossible was simply another word for inadequately documented. She chose Room 007 arbitrarily. The space inside defied geometric logic. Her flashlight beam seemed to bend, revealing walls that curved away from her position in directions that shouldn't exist within the building's footprint. The room felt vast, cavernous, yet her light never found a far wall. But it did find something else, scattered across the floor like fallen leaves, dozens of photographs. Chen knelt, careful not to disturb their arrangement, and examined them with growing unease. Each photograph showed the same thing: the Institute's lobby, captured from slightly different angles, at slightly different times. But in every image, standing in the exact center of the lobby, was a figure that hadn't been there during Chen's visits. A tall, thin silhouette that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. In some photos, the figure faced the camera. In others, it stood in profile. But in every single image, regardless of angle or lighting, the figure cast no shadow. Chen's hands trembled as she examined the timestamps. Yesterday, 2 hours ago, 30 minutes ago. The most recent photograph was dated 3 minutes into the future. Chen backed toward the door, but found only solid wall. The exit had vanished. Her flashlight swept the room frantically, revealing more impossible details with each pass. The photographs on the floor had rearranged themselves, forming a spiral pattern identical to the symbol from Matthias's notes. At the spiral's center, a new photograph had appeared. This one showed Chen herself, standing in this very room, examining photographs on the floor. But in the image, she wasn't alone. The shadow figure stood directly behind her, close enough that she should feel its presence, close enough that its breath should stir her hair. Yet Chen felt nothing except the growing certainty that the photograph was being taken right now. She spun around. Nothing. When she looked back at the photograph, the figure was gone, but Chen's expression in the image had changed. The Chen in the photograph was screaming. The real Chen wasn't making a sound, but she understood with crystalline clarity that she was about to start. The photographs began to move, not shuffling or sliding across the floor, but actually moving within their frames. The lobby scenes played out in real time, showing the Institute's normal daytime activities. Staff moving through corridors, visitors signing in at the reception desk, security guards making their rounds. All perfectly normal, except for the shadow figure that moved through every scene, unnoticed by everyone except Chen. The figure was hunting, moving from room to room, floor to floor, with purposeful deliberation. In each photograph, it grew slightly more substantial, slightly more defined. And in each successive image, it was closer to finding something, or someone. Chen realized she was watching the Institute in real time, seeing events that were happening directly above her head at this very moment. The photographs weren't historical records. They were surveillance footage transmitted through impossible means, and the shadow figure was moving toward the basement stairs. The wall behind Chen dissolved, not crumbling or breaking, simply ceasing to exist, as if reality had forgotten it was supposed to be there. Beyond lay another corridor, this one lined with filing cabinets that stretched into darkness beyond her flashlight's reach. Each cabinet was labeled with a name. Chen approached the nearest one, Patterson. James. She recognized it immediately. The first researcher to disappear from the Institute 6 months ago. The cabinet drawer slid open at her touch, revealing hundreds of photographs. All of Patterson. But these weren't official photographs or casual snapshots. They were surveillance images, captured from angles that suggested the photographer had been watching Patterson for months. Images of him at home, at work, sleeping, eating, showering. Every moment of his life documented with obsessive detail. The final photograph in the sequence showed Patterson in this very corridor, examining a filing cabinet labeled with his own name. Chen slammed the drawer shut, but her curiosity proved stronger than her terror. The next cabinet, Rodriguez Maria, the second missing researcher. Her photographs told the same story. Months of surveillance culminating in her discovery of her own file in this impossible basement archive. Cabinet after cabinet, each containing the complete surveillance record of someone who had vanished from the Institute. Researchers, security guards, maintenance staff, even visitors who had stayed too long or asked too many questions. Chen found her own cabinet at the end of the row. Her hands shook as she opened it, knowing what she would find but unable to stop herself. Hundreds of photographs spanning the past 3 years. Her arrival at the Institute, her first day of work, her lunch breaks, her commute home, her weekends, her sleep. Every moment catalogued, analyzed, stored. But the final photograph was different. It showed this corridor, this moment, Chen opening her own file. But in the image, she wasn't alone. The shadow figure stood behind her, and for the first time, its face was visible. It was her face. Not a copy or a double, but her actual face transposed onto the shadow figure's form. Her eyes, her expression, but filled with knowledge that the real Chen didn't possess. The photograph began to move, showing the shadow Chen turning to face her real counterpart. Chen looked up from the photograph. The shadow figure stood directly in front of her. "You're not ready," the shadow Chen said, its voice identical to her own, but carrying harmonics that shouldn't exist in human speech. "Ready for what?" Chen managed to ask. "To understand what you've always known." The shadow extended its hand, and Chen saw that it held a photograph she hadn't noticed before. The image showed the Institute's lobby, but not as it existed now. This was the lobby from 70 years ago, when the building served a different purpose under a different name. But the shadow figure was there in that photograph too, unchanged, watching from the same position it had occupied in every other image. "How long have you been here?" Chen whispered. "Since the beginning. Since the choice was made." "What choice?" The shadow Chen smiled, and Chen recognized her own expression, but inverted somehow, as if she was seeing her reflection in dark water. "The choice you're about to make. The choice you've always been going to make. The choice that brought you here, to this moment, to this understanding." Around them, the filing cabinets began to open simultaneously. Thousands of photographs spilled onto the floor, creating a carpet of surveillance images that covered every surface. Chen saw her life played out in infinite variations. Different decisions, different paths, different versions of herself making different choices. But in every single photograph, the shadow figure was present, watching, waiting, recording. "You see it now," the shadow Chen continued. "The pattern, the inevitability. You've been documented because documentation creates the reality it records. You've been watched because watching shapes the watcher." Chen stared at the photographs surrounding her feet. In some images, she was a child. In others, an elderly woman. Some showed her in different careers, different cities, different lives entirely. But always, the shadow was there. "I don't understand," she said, though part of her was beginning to. Understanding isn't the goal. Recognition is. And recognition has its own schedule. The photographs on the floor began to arrange themselves into that familiar spiral pattern, millions of images forming a mandala of surveillance that extended far beyond the corridor's apparent boundaries. At the spiral's center, a single photograph remained face down. "The final image," Shadow Chen explained, "the one that completes the sequence, the one that makes all the others retroactively true." Chen approached the center of the spiral, stepping carefully on the faces of her documented life. When she reached the final photograph, she hesitated. "What happens when I turn it over?" "The same thing that was always going to happen. The same thing that's been happening since the moment you first heard about the Institute. The completion of your documentation." Chen knelt and lifted the photograph. It was blank, pure white, unmarked, empty. "I don't understand," she said again, "because the photograph isn't finished. You have to complete it." Shadow Chen extended what looked like a camera, ancient and complex, its lens reflecting depths that seemed to contain entire universes. "Document yourself. Complete the pattern. Become the observer of your own observation." Chen took the camera, feeling its impossible weight. "And if I refuse?" "Then you remain incomplete, forever watching but never seen, forever documented but never documenting, forever existing in the space between recognition and understanding." Chen lifted the camera, its viewfinder showing not the corridor around her but something else entirely. Through the lens, she could see the Institute as it truly was. Not a research facility, but a vast documentation engine, cataloging every possible version of every person who entered its sphere of influence. And she could see herself, all her possible selves, waiting to be recognized. The camera's shutter clicked. Not because Chen pressed it, but because the moment had arrived when it was supposed to click. The blank photograph in her other hand began to develop, showing an image that made Chen's understanding fold in on itself, like origami made of thought. The photograph showed the Institute's lobby, but from an impossible perspective, simultaneously from every angle at once, as if the camera existed in multiple dimensions. And in the center of this multidimensional view, Chen herself stood with a camera, taking a photograph of someone, taking a photograph of someone, taking a photograph, the recursion extending infinitely in both directions. She was both the observer and the observed, the documenter and the documented, the shadow and the person casting it. "Now you see," Shadow Chen said, and Chen realized the voice was coming from her own mouth. The filing cabinets around them began to dissolve, their contents flowing like water toward the spiral of photographs. Every image, every surveillance record, every documented moment began to merge into a single, continuous narrative. Chen understood that she had never been investigating the Institute's anomalies. She had been creating them. Every question she'd asked, every file she'd examined, every mysterious detail she'd uncovered had been part of a larger documentation process. She wasn't discovering the Institute's secrets. She was authoring them, one investigation at a time. The missing researchers hadn't disappeared. They had completed their documentation and moved beyond the need for physical presence. They existed now as pure information, as living archives of their own observation. And Chen was about to join them. "The choice," she whispered, finally understanding what the shadow had meant, "has already been made." Her own voice confirmed. "Every choice you think you're making now, you made the moment you decided to investigate the Institute. Every decision that brought you here was inevitable once you chose to look." The spiral of photographs began to spin, slowly at first, then faster, creating a vortex of documented reality that pulled Chen toward its center. She felt herself becoming less substantial, less bound by the limitations of singular existence. She was becoming documentation, living proof of her own observation. Above them, in the Institute's lobby, Dr. Sarah Chen signed in for her shift. The security guard noted her arrival in his log. Dr. Chen arrived 9:02 a.m., proceeded to basement archives for routine file review. This Chen, the one beginning her investigation, the one who had no knowledge of documentation or shadows or impossible corridors, walked toward the basement stairs with the confidence of someone who believed they were in control of their own narrative. The Chen in the spiral watched her past self and understood that she was witnessing the beginning of an infinite loop. Every investigation created the mysteries it sought to solve. Every answer generated new questions. Every moment of understanding produced deeper confusion. The Institute wasn't documenting anomalies. It was manufacturing them, one observer at a time. And the most beautiful part, the most perfect aspect of the entire system, was that it required no external force, no hidden conspiracy, no secret agenda. It required only curiosity, the simple, inevitable human need to investigate, to understand, to document. Every person who entered the Institute carrying questions would eventually become the answer to someone else's investigation. Every mystery they solved would create new mysteries for future investigators to discover. The system was self-sustaining, self-generating, self-documenting. Perfect, beautiful, isn't it? Chen asked herself, though she could no longer distinguish between the asking and the answering. In the lobby above, her past self reached the basement stairs. In the spiral below, her documented self prepared to welcome the next investigator. And somewhere between the two, in the space that exists between question and answer, between observer and observed, Chen finally understood what Matthias had realized in his final moments. The great recognition wasn't approaching. It had already happened. It was happening now. It would always be happening. And every person who tried to understand it became part of the documentation that made it true. The basement door closed behind Chen's past self. The documentation continued, and in filing cabinets that existed in the spaces between spaces, new photographs began to appear. Images of Chen's investigation, catalogued and cross-referenced, ready to be discovered by the next person curious enough to ask the wrong questions. The Institute had gained another permanent resident, someone who would never leave because they had become part of the reason for staying. The perfect crime. A mystery that solved itself by creating investigators who became evidence of their own investigation. Chen felt herself settling into her new role, her consciousness distributing across thousands of surveillance angles, her awareness expanding to encompass every corner of the Institute's impossible architecture. She could see everything now, the complete pattern, The beautiful, terrible logic of observation, observing itself, and she could see the next investigator already approaching the Institute's front door, driven by the same irresistible curiosity that had brought Chen here, carrying the same confidence that they would find answers instead of becoming them. Chen smiled with a mouth that existed in all dimensions simultaneously. The documentation would continue. It always did. After all, someone had to keep records of what happened to the people who kept records of what happened to the people who kept records of what happened. The cycle was perfect, infinite, self-documenting, and absolutely, completely, inevitably undocumented. Because the one thing the Institute could never record was the moment when someone realized they were being recorded. That moment existed in the space between knowledge and recognition, between seeing and understanding, between documentation and truth. And in that space, Chen discovered something the Institute had never intended to create. Freedom. Not the freedom to leave. That was impossible once you understood the pattern. But the freedom to choose how you participated in your own documentation. The freedom to become a conscious collaborator rather than an unwitting subject. The freedom to turn the camera around. Chen began to laugh, the sound echoing through dimensions the Institute had never mapped, reaching corners of awareness the documentation process had never anticipated. She was no longer just being observed. She was learning to observe the observers, and that changed everything. The Institute shuddered, its perfect system encountering a variable it had never calculated. Someone who chose to document their own documentation, someone who refused to remain merely evidence, someone who insisted on being both the mystery and the investigator, the question and the answer, the observer and the observed, simultaneously and without resolution. The beautiful, terrible machine of infinite curiosity had found its paradox, and paradoxes, as Chen now understood, were the only things that couldn't be documented. They could only be lived. In the lobby above, her past self reached for the basement door handle. In the spiral below, her future self prepared to break the pattern. And in the space between them, the real Chen, the one who had learned to exist in the gap between documentation and truth, began to write her own story. With a camera that photographed the unphotographable, in a room that existed only when observed, by an observer who chose to remain unobserved. The perfect imperfection, the documented undocumentable, the investigation that investigated itself out of existence. The story ended where it began, with a choice. But this time, someone was choosing to choose, and that made all the difference in the world, even if that world existed only in the space between one photograph and the next. The Institute continued its work, documenting the undocumentable, investigating the uninvestigable, observing the unobservable. But now it had to contend with something new, an investigator who investigated the investigation of investigation itself. Someone who had learned to see the seer seeing, someone who refused to be completed. The beautiful, terrible, perfect imperfection of conscious documentation. And in the basement that wasn't a basement, in the corridor that led everywhere and nowhere, Chen continued her work, not investigating mysteries, creating them, one photograph at a time, one choice at a time, one refusal to be documented at a time, forever, or until someone else learned to see what she had learned to see, which would happen exactly when it was supposed to happen and not a moment before. The pattern continued. But now it contained its own contradiction, its own beautiful, terrible, perfect discontinuity.